21st May 1940. Arras, northern France. German 37mm crews fired and watched their rounds ricochet off British steel like pebbles thrown at a castle wall. They fired again. Another bounce. Again. Nothing. The tanks kept coming. Not an army of heavy tanks, just 16 of them. 16 Matilda IIs. The rest of the British column were older Matilda Is, armed only with machine guns, but the Matilda II was the problem. Its armor was so thick that the standard German anti-tank gun could only knock. Erwin Rommel, commander of the 7th Panzer Division, returned from a forward reconnaissance to find his division in chaos. His aide, Lieutenant Most, died beside him, and Rommel himself was splattered with the man's blood. Transport vehicles burned across the horizon. His soldiers, the same men who had torn through Poland in weeks, were running from 16 tanks. The Germans would soon give their own 37mm anti-tank gun a new name, the Heeresankloppgerät, the Army Door Knocker, because against 78mm of British armor, that is all it could do: knock. The legend that Rommel wasted his entire ammunition supply that afternoon is excellent drama, though historians debate the literal truth of it. But what isn't up for debate is the crisis of engineering that occurred that day. To understand why 16 tanks could panic a panzer division, we have to look at what British engineers built and why no one else had anything like it. British tank philosophy in the 1930s was split. You had cruiser tanks designed to be fast cavalry, rushing through gaps in the line, and then you had infantry tanks. These weren't built for speed, they were built to walk. They advanced at a walking pace alongside foot soldiers, designed to absorb punishment that would vaporize lighter vehicles. Speed was irrelevant, survival was everything. The Matilda II was the ultimate expression of this survival doctrine. Engineers at the Royal Arsenal prioritized protection above all else. The result was a vehicle that weighed 27 tons but crawled at a max speed of 15 miles per hour on roads and a painful 6 miles per hour off-road. It was powered by twin diesel bus engines, and to modernize, it looked like a relic. But look at the armor. The frontal plate was 78mm thick. The turret, 75mm. Even the sides were 65mm. In 1940, the standard German Panzer III and IV had barely 30mm of frontal armor. The Matilda carried more than double that. Inside this steel cocoon, the crew was safe in a way no other tanker on Earth was. When Britain declared war in 1939, production was painfully slow. Building these walking fortresses required precise casting and fitting. By May 1940, the 7th Royal Tank Regiment in France had only 23 of them ready to fight. But, as it turned out, they didn't need many. The standard German anti-tank gun, the Pak-36, was a light, mobile weapon that had decimated Polish forces. German crews trusted it implicitly, but against the Matilda, the math was brutal. At 100 meters, the Pak-36 could penetrate about 34mm of armor. The Matilda had 78mm. There was a deficit of over 40mm. It didn't matter how good the German aim was, physics was against them. This brings us back to the counterattack at Arras. The British force, cobbled together with just 16 of these Matilda IIs, launched their assault. They rolled over German anti-tank lines at Achicourt. One Matilda reported taking 14 direct hits, and the commander later noted it had no harmful effect, just gouged out a bit of armor. German gunners, watching their best shots bounce harmlessly into the French countryside, abandoned their guns or feigned death as the iron monsters rolled over them. The panic was contagious. Reports filtered up to high command of hundreds of heavy tanks. Rommel, finding his division crumbling, had to improvise. He realized his standard guns were useless. He pulled 88mm flak guns, usually reserved for shooting down aircraft, and leveled them at the tanks. He also brought up 105mm field howitzers. It was a desperate defense. The 88 was the only thing that could punch through a Matilda, and combined with Stuka dive bombers, the British advance was finally halted. But the cost was staggering. In one afternoon, the 7th Panzer Division suffered casualties equal to their previous 4 days of combat combined. Now that we have seen how Rommel solved the crisis and what it cost both sides, if you are finding this deep dive into British engineering interesting, consider subscribing. It takes a moment, costs nothing, and helps the channel grow. The tactical victory belonged to the Germans, but the psychological scar remained. The shock of Arras ripple-affected all the way to Hitler, contributing to the halt order that allowed the evacuation at Dunkirk. But the Matilda's story didn't end in France. It earned its legendary status in the sands of North Africa. During Operation Compass in late 1940, the Matilda II faced Italian forces. If the German guns struggled, the Italian weapons were hopeless. Their M1340 tanks had paper-thin armor compared to the British behemoth. At the Battle of Nibewa, 57 Matildas helped capture 4,000 prisoners for the loss of just 2 British soldiers. They called it the Queen of the Desert, and for a time it reigned supreme. However, warfare evolves rapidly. When Rommel arrived in Africa with the Afrika Korps, he brought the lesson he learned at Arras with him, the 88mm gun. He began baiting British tanks into flak traps, camouflaged lines of 88s. At Hellfire Pass in June 1941, British Matildas charged what they thought were weak positions, only to be obliterated at point-blank range by hidden anti-aircraft guns. In a single battle, the Queen lost her crown. The Matilda's fatal flaw wasn't its armor, but its offense. The turret ring was too small, just 54 inches. It couldn't accept a gun larger than the 2-pounder. As German tanks got thicker armor, the Matilda couldn't hurt them back. By 1942, it was being phased out for the Valentine and the Sherman. Yet the hull lived on. It found new life in the Pacific with Australian forces, where the thick armor made it an excellent bunker buster against Japanese positions, and as the specialized Scorpion mine-clearing flail. The lesson of the Matilda II is that armor protection can momentarily change the course of history. For one desperate afternoon in May 1940, 16 slow, strange-looking tanks terrified the German army. They proved that speed and firepower aren't always enough. The Matilda proved what happens when you build something your enemy cannot kill. German gun crews discovered their nickname, the Door Knocker. Watching their rounds ricochet off British steel, they could knock all they wanted.